Eliza Rourke was 26 years old when she stood in the mud outside her father-in-law's house with everything she owned wrapped in a single flour sack, and she had nowhere left to go. It was Silas Rourke who put her out, the very evening after her husband was buried, declaring in front of the whole family that a widow with no children and no dowry was a mouth he would not feed. What little she had was $4 and some odd cents sewn into the hem of her only good dress, and with it she walked 3 days into the town of Larkspur Hollow, Colorado Territory, where she paid $5, the last of her money borrowed against a promise to sweep floors, for an abandoned general store that had sat boarded and forgotten at the end of Miners Row for 11 years. The bank clerk laughed when he took her coins. The store, he said, was worthless, rotted through, home to nothing but mice and dust. He did not know, and neither did she, that behind the sagging shelves of that store waited a secret sealed away by the very man who built the town, a secret that would not only save Eliza Rourke from ruin, but would restore to an entire valley of families something that had been quietly stolen from them for a generation. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eliza Rourke. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a town too small for the map or a life too quiet for anyone to notice, we hope you will tell us about it in the comments below because this story is for you. Eliza had not always been a woman who counted pennies in the hem of her dress. She was born Eliza Standish in 1851 on a modest farm outside of Independence, Missouri, the third of 5 children to a father who kept bees and a mother who kept ledgers. Real ledgers, for she had been taught letters and numbers by a traveling schoolmistress and never once let the skill go soft with disuse. It was her mother, Constance Standish, who first placed a worn account book into young Eliza's hands and told her that a woman who could read a column of figures could never be fully cheated, for numbers, unlike men, did not know how to lie convincingly. Eliza took this lesson the way some children take religion, with a quiet and total devotion. By the age of 12 she was keeping the household accounts herself, correcting the miller's tally when he shorted them on flour, and noticing, long before her father did, that a neighbor's promissory note carried an interest rate that would swallow his farm whole within 5 years. She loved the smell of ink and the order of a well-kept page, the way a column of numbers, properly summed, told a story as true as any spoken word. Her father used to say that Eliza could find the honest truth hiding inside a dishonest man's arithmetic, and it was a gift, though in those years it seemed a small and domestic one, useful only for keeping bees and flour honest. She married young, at 19, to a gentle, soft-spoken man named Thomas Rourke, the second son of a family that had made a modest fortune freighting goods along the wagon roads west. Thomas was not ambitious in the way his father Silas was ambitious. He had no hunger for land or standing, only a quiet contentment in fixing wagon wheels and reading aloud to Eliza by lamplight, and it was this gentleness that she loved in him, a gentleness so unlike the hard bargaining world she had grown up watching her father navigate. They had 8 years together, years that were not easy, 2 children lost in infancy, a hard winter that took most of their savings, a fire that destroyed Thomas's small freight office in Kansas. But through every hardship Eliza kept the books, kept the family solvent through sheer stubborn arithmetic, and kept her faith that decency, properly accounted for, always balanced out in the end. Silas Rourke never much cared for his daughter-in-law. He thought her too plain-spoken, too quick with a number, unbecoming in a woman he believed ought to simply be grateful for a Rourke name. But Thomas loved her, and for 8 years that love was enough to keep the peace between them, however thin that peace had always been. Then came the spring of 1878, when a fever swept through the freight camps along the Western Trail, and Thomas, who had gone out to settle accounts with a supplier in Cheyenne, did not come home. Eliza buried her husband on a hillside outside a town she barely knew, 300 miles from anyone who loved her, and when she returned to the Rourke household expecting at least the shelter of a family she had served faithfully for 8 years, she found instead a cold reckoning. Silas Rourke had never forgiven her for marrying beneath what he considered his son's prospects, and with Thomas gone, he saw no reason to continue supporting a widow who brought the family no children, no land, and no name that mattered. He told her, in front of his remaining sons and their wives, that she had 30 days to find another situation, and when 30 days came and she had found nothing, he set her belongings on the porch himself and told her the Rourke house was no longer her home. It did not matter that she had kept his son's books honest for 8 years, that she had nursed his own wife through a bout of pneumonia 2 winters before, that she had never once, in 8 years of marriage, asked the family for anything beyond her keep. To Silas Rourke, a widow without children was simply a debt that had stopped paying interest, and he closed the account without ceremony. Eliza walked away from that house with $4.11 sewn into her hem, a single change of clothes, her mother's old account book, and a grief so large it seemed to walk beside her like a second shadow. She had no family left in Missouri worth the journey home to, no trade beyond bookkeeping that any respectable establishment would hire a woman to perform, and no prospects beyond whatever charity a stranger might extend to a widow on the road. She walked, and when walking grew too hard, she rode in the back of freight wagons in exchange for mending harness leather or minding a driver's ledger, until 3 days later she found herself standing in the single dusty street of Larkspur Hollow, a mining town of perhaps 400 souls tucked into a fold of the Rocky Mountain foothills, where the air smelled of pine sap and coal smoke and the mountains rose up so close and so sudden that the town seemed to exist in a kind of permanent, sheltering shadow. Larkspur Hollow had been built 20 years before around a silver strike, and though the richest veins had long since played out, the town had survived on smaller, steadier mining and on the freight trade passing through toward the higher camps. It was a town that had seen better days and knew it, its false-fronted buildings weathered gray, its boardwalks patched and repatched, its population thinned by every hard winter that sent the less determined families back east. Eliza arrived with no plan beyond finding a night's shelter, and it was outside the town's small bank, a squat brick building at the crossing of Main and Miners Row, that she overheard the clerk discussing an auction. The county was disposing of a derelict property to recover back taxes, a general store that had stood empty and boarded for 11 years, ever since its original proprietor, a man named Josiah Kettering, had vanished from town without warning or explanation in the autumn of 1867. Nobody in Larkspur Hollow wanted the place. It was said to be settling badly on its foundation, its roof half collapsed at the rear, its interior stripped of anything worth stealing years before. But the county wanted it off the tax rolls, and so the clerk announced almost as an afterthought that they would take any reasonable offer that morning, however small. Eliza had $4.11 to her name and nowhere to sleep that night, and though every practical instinct told her that spending her last money on a ruined building was the act of a desperate fool, some quieter instinct, the same instinct that had once caught a miller shorting her family's flour, the same instinct that trusted the honest truth hidden inside dishonest arithmetic, told her that a roof, however broken, was still a roof and that a building, however worthless the town believed it to be, was still worth more than an empty hand. She offered every cent she had for $11, and when the clerk, more amused than impressed, rounded her offer down and accepted $5 even from the town's own petty cash to cover the difference just to close the matter and be done with it, Eliza Rourke became the owner of the old Kettering General Store, and the whole street watched her walk toward it with something between pity and mild entertainment, certain they would see her gone within the week. The store, when she pushed open its warped door for the first time, smelled of dust and mouse droppings and the particular staleness of air that has not moved freely in over a decade. Sunlight came through gaps in the boarded windows and thin dust-swimming shafts, illuminating a long room lined on both sides with heavy pine shelving, most of it collapsed or leaning, a counter at the rear coated in a decade of grime, and a floor so thick with dust that her footsteps left prints like snow. It was, by any honest accounting, a ruin. But Eliza had spent her whole life reading truth out of things other people dismissed, and as she stood in that dim, dust-choked room with the last light of a Colorado afternoon slanting through broken boards, she felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon after Thomas's death, a small, stubborn flicker of purpose. She spent her first night in Larkspur Hollow sleeping on a bed of old feed sacks behind the store's counter, and she spent her first full day sweeping. It was honest, punishing work, hauling out broken shelving, scrubbing a decade of grime from the floorboards, prying loose the boards over the front windows to let in real daylight for the first time in 11 years, and as she worked, the townsfolk of Larkspur Hollow began to take notice of her in the particular way that small towns notice anything unusual, which is to say with equal parts curiosity and suspicion. An older woman named Hattie Bloom, who ran the town's boarding house, brought her a loaf of bread on the second day, less out of generosity, she claimed, than to satisfy her own curiosity about the widow who'd bought Kettering's ruin. A boy named Daniel Ferris, perhaps 11 years old, took to sitting on the boardwalk across the street to watch her work, until on the third day Eliza put him to work too, in exchange for a nickel and the promise of a hot meal, and the boy proved a willing and clever helper who knew every family in town and was happy to tell her about them. It was on the fourth day, while clearing debris from behind the long run of shelving on the store's north wall, that Eliza first noticed something odd. The shelving unit ran the full length of the wall, floor to ceiling, and though most of the store's fixtures had been stripped or sold off by scavengers over the years, this particular run of shelves had been left curiously intact, its heavy pine boards bolted with an unusual number of iron brackets, far more than such simple shelving would ever require. When she leaned her weight against it to test its sturdiness before deciding whether to keep or discard it, The entire unit did not merely wobble as loose shelving should, it shifted as one solid piece, swinging outward from the wall on a set of hidden hinges she had not noticed beneath the grime, revealing behind it not the raw log wall of the building's exterior as she had expected, but a narrow door no more than 3 feet wide, built of the same heavy pine and fitted so precisely into the wall that from the front of the store it would have been entirely invisible even with the shelving removed. Eliza stood very still for a long moment, her heart beating with a strange mixture of fear and wonder, before she found the courage to try the door's iron latch. It gave, stiff with rust but not locked, and swung inward onto a room she had not known existed. A space perhaps 8 feet square, tucked between the store's back wall and what she now realized was a false wall built deliberately to conceal it, lit by a single small window near the ceiling that someone had long ago covered with a wooden shutter from the outside. Dust lay thick over everything, but even in the dim light filtering through cracks in the shutter, Eliza could see that the room was not empty. Along one wall stood a heavy iron-bound trunk. Against another leaned a rolled canvas, tied with cord gone brittle with age. And upon a small writing desk in the corner sat a stack of ledgers, bound in cracked leather, exactly the kind of accounting books Eliza had kept her whole life, and beside them, weighted down by a smooth river stone, a single sealed envelope with her predecessor's name written across its front in a careful, deliberate hand, Josiah Kettering. She did not open everything that first evening. She was cautious by nature, and something about the careful concealment of that room, the hidden hinges, the false wall, the deliberate secrecy of it, told her that whatever waited inside deserved to be approached with patience rather than haste. But she did light a lamp, and she did open the sealed envelope, and what she read there by lamplight, alone in a dead man's hidden room on the 4th night of her new life in Larkspur Hollow, changed the entire shape of what she understood herself to have purchased for $5. The letter was dated the 3rd of October, 1867, and it was written by Josiah Kettering to whoever might one day find it, for he confessed in its opening lines that he did not expect to return to Larkspur Hollow, and that he wished to leave behind an honest accounting of a dishonest matter, in case God or circumstance ever saw fit to set it right. Kettering wrote that he had founded his general store in 1859 as one of 6 original signers of what the town's founders had called the Larkspur Compact, an agreement, drawn up and notarized when the Silver Strike first drew settlers to the Hollow, that bound the town's founding businessmen and the mining company that financed the original claim into a cooperative arrangement, in exchange for the founders' capital and labor in building the town's infrastructure, roads, a school, a proper water system. Every family who settled and worked claims or businesses within the original town boundary before 1862 would hold a permanent, inheritable share in the profits of the Larkspur Mining Company's central vein, the vein that ran directly beneath the town itself and that everyone had assumed for 2 decades now, belonged entirely and exclusively to the company's owner. But the mine's owner, a man named Reginald Ashworth who had arrived in the Hollow only after the compact was signed and had gradually bought out or bullied aside most of the original signers, had spent years quietly suppressing every copy of that agreement he could locate, Kettering wrote, convincing newer arrivals and even some of the founding families themselves that no such compact had ever existed, that the shares were a rumor, a miner's tall tale. Kettering had refused to hand over his copy, the original notarized compact itself, and Ashworth's response had grown from persuasion to threat, until Kettering, fearing for his safety and unwilling to be bought or broken, had hidden the compact along with his store's true ledgers, records that proved the mine's actual production and the shares rightfully owed, in this concealed room, and had fled Larkspur Hollow in the dead of night, intending to seek a lawyer in Denver who might help him bring the matter to justice, never suspecting he would not live to return. Eliza would later learn, through careful inquiry, that Josiah Kettering had in fact died of pneumonia in a Denver boarding house only weeks after fleeing the Hollow, his mission unfinished, his secret sealed forever behind a hidden door that no one left in Larkspur Hollow even remembered to look for. For 3 days, Eliza worked through the contents of that hidden room with the same patient thoroughness her mother had taught her over a childhood account book, and what she found confirmed every word of Kettering's letter. The iron-bound trunk held the original Larkspur Compact itself, its 6 founding signatures still legible, its language plain and binding, a permanent claim on mining profits for every founding family, recorded and witnessed before a territorial notary whose seal was still crisp upon the page. The ledgers held Kettering's own careful records of the mine's early production, cross-referenced against the company's public reports, showing a pattern of underreporting that had begun the very year Ashworth took control and had continued, by Eliza's careful recalculation, for 11 years running. And rolled within the canvas, she found something Kettering's letter had not even mentioned, a hand-drawn survey map of the original town boundary, marking precisely which families and businesses had been present before 1862 and were therefore entitled, by the compact's own terms, to a rightful share of a fortune that Reginald Ashworth had spent 2 decades quietly stealing from beneath their feet. Eliza understood immediately the size of what she now held, and she understood, too, the danger of it. Reginald Ashworth was no longer merely a mine owner in Larkspur Hollow. Over the years he had become the town's largest landholder, its principal creditor, and by quiet extension its most powerful citizen, a man whose name sat on the bank's board and whose influence touched nearly every family's livelihood. When Eliza began, cautiously at first, to ask around town about the old Kettering store and what had become of its original owner, she found that Hattie Bloom and a few of the oldest residents remembered Josiah Kettering fondly but vaguely, remembered too that he had simply vanished one autumn with no explanation, and that Ashworth himself had been the one to spread word, gently and repeatedly over the following years, that Kettering had absconded owing debts, a story nobody had ever thought to question because nobody had reason to. It became clear to Eliza that if she brought the compact forward carelessly, Ashworth would simply deny its authenticity, discredit her as a stranger and a fool who'd bought a worthless building, and quite possibly find some pretext to have her run out of Larkspur Hollow before she ever reached a lawyer or a judge. So Eliza did what she had always done best. She built her case in numbers first, and let the numbers carry the truth where words alone might be doubted. She spent long nights by lamplight in the hidden room, cross-referencing Kettering's original production ledgers against every public record of the mine's output she could locate in the town's newspaper archive and the assay office's yearly reports, building a careful accounting of exactly how many ounces of silver had been extracted from beneath Larkspur Hollow since 1867, and exactly how much of that fortune, by the compact's own binding terms, was rightfully owed and never paid to 11 founding families still living in the Hollow, families like the Ferris boys' own grandparents, like Hattie Bloom's late husband's people, like nearly a third of the households on the town's modest streets. It took her the better part of 2 months, working the store by day to keep herself fed and the hidden room by night to build her accounting, and in that time she told almost no one what she had found, confiding only eventually in Hattie Bloom, whose late husband's name appeared among the original compact's beneficiaries, and whose fierce, quiet outrage on learning the truth became Eliza's first and steadiest ally. Word travels in small towns whether a person wishes it to or not, and by the time Eliza had finished her accounting, whispers had already begun to move through Larkspur Hollow that the widow at the old Kettering store had found something in that ruined building, something to do with old Josiah Kettering and the mine, and Reginald Ashworth heard those whispers too. He came to the store himself one gray November afternoon, dressed in a fine wool coat entirely out of place among the dust and half-repaired shelves, and he was at first all courtesy, complimenting Eliza on her industry, offering to buy the store back from her at a generous multiple of what she'd paid, framing it as a kindness to a struggling widow who surely had no real future in so small and hard a town. When Eliza declined, politely but plainly, his courtesy thinned quickly into something harder. He told her, in a voice gone cold and precise, that old buildings sometimes held old rumors, and that rumors, left unchecked, had a way of causing trouble for people who repeated them, and he suggested, without ever quite threatening it outright, that a woman alone with no family and no standing in the territory would do well to remember how easily a bank could call in the note on a struggling business, how easily a landlord's goodwill could dry up, how easily a stranger's welcome in a small town could sour. Eliza listened to all of it without flinching, for she had faced Silas Rourke's cold arithmetic of who deserved shelter and who did not, and she had learned that men who threatened rather than argued were generally men who feared they had already lost the argument. When Ashworth finished, she told him, calmly, that she had no interest in rumors, only in a properly notarized legal instrument and 11 years of production ledgers that any competent territorial judge would find compelling reading, and she watched something flicker behind his composed face that told her, more surely than any confession could have, that every word of Kettering's letter had been true. The following weeks were the hardest of Eliza's short time in Larkspur Hollow. Ashworth moved quickly and quietly to isolate her, calling in a small note the bank held on her store's back taxes that she had not even known was outstanding, spreading word among the town's merchants that the widow at Kettering's was not to be trusted or extended credit, even attempting, through an intermediary, to have the county clerk question the legality of her original $5 purchase of the property itself. For a time it seemed the whole weight of the town's established power might simply grind her down before she ever reached a court, and there were nights, alone in that store with the wind rattling the windows Thomas would have fixed so easily, when Eliza allowed herself to wonder whether she had traded one kind of poverty for a more dangerous one. But Hattie Bloom did not waver, and neither, once the story quietly reached him, did the Ferris family, nor 3 other founding households who had lived in the hollow long enough to remember Kettering and to recognize, once shown the ledgers, the shape of a theft that had touched their own tables for 2 decades without their ever knowing its name. Eliza wrote, with careful patience, to a territorial judge in Denver whose reputation for fairness Kettering himself had once mentioned in a margin note, enclosing copies of the compact, the ledgers, and her own careful accounting, and she waited through a long, cold December for any answer at all, running her store by day and guarding her hidden room by night, refusing every renewed offer Ashworth sent her way and refusing, too, to let his intimidation curdle into fear that showed on her face. In front of the town. The judge's answer came in late January of 1879, and it came not as a letter but as the judge himself, arriving on the winter stage with a territorial marshal and a formal order to examine the original Larkspur Compact and its accompanying records. What followed was neither swift nor simple, for Ashworth fought the claim through every legal delay available to him, but the evidence Eliza had built, ledger against ledger, year against year, name against name, proved too precise and too damning to dismiss, and by the spring thaw the judge issued his ruling. The Larkspur Compact was authentic and binding, the 11 founding families named upon it were owed, collectively, a sum that Ashworth's mind could not simply absorb without consequence. And Ashworth himself, facing not only the financial reckoning but formal charges of fraud brought by the territorial court, was compelled to relinquish controlling interest in the Larkspur Mining Company entirely, selling his remaining shares at a steep loss to satisfy the judgment, and departing the hollow that same summer a diminished and disgraced man. His name thereafter spoken in Larkspur Hollow the way one speaks of a hard winter survived rather than a person still respected. The restitution, once it came, did not make Eliza Rourke a wealthy woman, for she took for herself only what the compact's terms actually entitled her to as the store's rightful owner, and even that she used carefully, repairing her roof, restocking her shelves, and setting aside the rest as a modest reserve. But for the town of Larkspur Hollow, the restoration was profound. 11 founding families received at last shares and back payment that let the Ferris family finally send young Daniel to a proper school in Denver, that let Hattie Bloom expand her boarding house into the first real hotel the town had ever had, that let 3 struggling ranching families clear debts that had shadowed them for years. The town itself, freed from Ashworth's grip on its bank and its credit, began to breathe in a way it had not in a generation, and Eliza Rourke's general store, rebuilt and restocked, became not merely a shop but something closer to the town's beating heart, a place where the accounting was always honest and the shelves, people liked to say, sometimes held more than anyone expected. It is worth returning now to where we began, to a 26-year-old widow standing in the mud outside a house that would not have her, with $4.11 sewn into her hem and nowhere in the world to go. Eliza Rourke did not know, on the night Silas Rourke set her belongings on his porch, that the very qualities he found so unbecoming in her, her plain-spoken honesty, her stubborn faith in numbers, her refusal to accept a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth, were exactly the qualities that would one day set right a wrong that had shadowed an entire valley for 11 years. She did not know, standing outside a boarded and forgotten store that the whole street believed worthless, that behind its sagging shelves waited not merely a hidden room but a chance to prove that value, like truth, does not always announce itself plainly, and that the people and places the world is quickest to write off are very often the ones holding, quietly, everything that matters. What Eliza Rourke restored to Larkspur Hollow was never simply silver. It was the plain, binding promise that a town's founders had once made to one another and to their children, a promise that had been buried not by time but by greed, and that only patience, honesty, and a willingness to look behind what everyone else had already dismissed could bring back into the light. Thank you for spending this time with Eliza Rourke, and with all the quiet, overlooked corners of Larkspur Hollow that her patience and her honesty helped restore. If her story moved you, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need to hear that what looks worthless to the world is not always worthless in truth, and if you have a moment we would love to know. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.